VMO-6 antecedents reach back to 1920 at Quantico, Virginia. Through a succession of unit redesignations, Marine Observation Squadron 6, originally designated VO-6M, came into being in 1927. This is the original airfield at Quantico. During the 20s and 30s, this was the only home for Marine Corps aviation. The squadron operated a variety of aircraft during this early period. Their missions were observation and primary flight training for student aviators. In early 1928, the squadron embarked aboard the USS Saratoga, bound for Nicaragua to fight the Sandinista guerrillas. The squadron was flying the Curtiss Falcon. Their missions included visual reconnaissance, aerial photography, infantry liaison, and emergency resupply. Here in Nicaragua, the squadron developed the doctrine of close air support, strafing and bombing in advance of friendly patrols. These tactics were later developed into a fine art by the Marine Corps.
In addition to the Curtiss Falcon, the squadron also flew the Atlantic TA-1, a version of the Ford and Fokker trimotors. They were used for transport and aerial supply. As an aside, although most of the area in Nicaragua was very primitive, Managua had an established airfield with permanent hangars. Apparently, during the 20s, there was a lot of interest and money invested in aviation. Both the hangars at Managua and the squadron, receiving new aircraft every couple of years, are examples of this cash input. In 1928, the squadron was relocated back to Quantico. In addition to their missions, they conducted flight demonstrations for the field officers class, now known as the Basic School at Marine Corps Schools. The 30s found the squadron employing a varied aircraft inventory, including the Vought Corsair, and later the Curtiss Helldiver. In the 30s, America loved aviation. VO-6M formed a demonstration team that furthered Marine Corps public relations by performing at various air races and airport openings. Calling themselves the Helldivers, their daring maneuvers impressed spectators so favorably that by 1932 they were representing the Marine Corps at major events such as the Canadian Air Pageant and the U.S. National Air Races in Cleveland. However, just as times had been opportune for the squadron, it was external circumstances that ended the first chapter in their history. The Marine Corps had the mission of defending advanced naval bases. The Commandant recommended a light bombing squadron be incorporated into the 1934 Naval Operations Organization, with no increase in total Marine squadrons. This required the disestablishment of an observation squadron. At midnight on 30 June 1933, VO-6M was removed from active duty roles. The designation VO-6M lived on in the reserves, first at Brooklyn, New York, and later in Minneapolis. In 1937, however, VO-6M was redesignated VMS-6R, closing the first chapter of the observation squadron.
The squadron was reactivated on 20 November 1944 at Quantico, and 6 days later, with its OY aircraft, was transferred to Camp Pendleton, California, where it commenced training for further Pacific combat operations with the 6th Marine Division that was also forming at that time. In January 1945, the squadron departed for Guadalcanal, at which time it was assigned to the 15th Marines, the artillery regiment for the 6th Marine Division. Upon completion of training, the squadron was staged for its participation in the operation to seize Okinawa. Shortly after D-Day, 1 April 1945, VMO-6 moved ashore and commenced operations from recently captured Yamitan airstrip. During the ensuing battle for the island, VMO-6 flew its OY aircraft on a variety of missions, including artillery spotting, message pickups, photo reconnaissance, and medical evacuation in litter-equipped OY-1s. In July 1945, the squadron departed for Guam, where it remained until the termination of hostilities. In October 1945, VMO-6 was deployed to Tientsin, North China, to participate in the occupation. The squadron terminated its China service January 1947 when the Communist forces pushed their way south to Tientsin.
Next stop was the United States, where VMO-6 took up residency at the Chapo Flats airstrip at Camp Pendleton. Quiet years of training and improvement on tactics followed until North Korea's invasion of South Korea. Again, the call came for VMO-6 to depart from its peacetime home and move into combat. HO-3S-1 helicopters and pilots from HMX-1 at Quantico, Virginia, joined the squadron. VMO-6 departed the United States in July 1950 as the first combat helicopter unit in the Marine Corps. The squadron arrived in Kobe, Japan with its complement of 6 HO-3S-1s and 8 OY-1s. After a short stop at Itami Air Force Base, Japan, it was on to Busan, Korea. Almost immediately, the squadron began making a name for itself. The command and control capability of the helicopter was tested and proved to be a resounding success. The OYs were flown as convoy escort for the 1st Marine Brigade, in addition to observation and reconnaissance missions. In August 1950, the squadron carried out its first medevac. These life-saving missions became a day-to-day part of life for VMO-6 pilots and crewmen. The first night medevac of the war was flown by Captain, now Major General, Victor A. Armstrong. After Busan, it was the Incheon landing, then on up to the Chosin Reservoir.
In December 1950, the squadron received Bell HTL-3s and 4s. The HTL-3 was found to be underpowered, and the landing gear was not suitable for rough terrain, so it was soon transferred out. In May 1951, VMO-6 received its first all-metal Cessna OE-1 to replace the fabric-covered OYs. By April of 1952, all of the OYs and the HO-3Ss had been transferred out, leaving only the OE-1s and the HTLs in VMO. As the tempo of war became more fixed, the squadron took up residence at Bancroft Field at Tongo-ri near Munsan-ni. A staple of the camp were these beautiful Marine Corps green condominiums. Of course, with the lovely condominiums, you have gourmet chefs. Tradition is never ending in the Marine Corps. Happy Marine Corps birthday from Korea. In July 1952, the squadron started receiving the new Sikorsky HO-5S to replace the Bells. Although we had plenty of white sand, we did not have to contend with the snow.
After the cessation of hostilities and a short post-conflict tour, the squadron returned to the United States in May 1955 to its home at Camp Pendleton. During 1956, the squadron began receiving 2 new aircraft, the OE-2 and the Kamen HOK. The following years were peaceful, involving training until the Cuban crisis of October 1962. A flight echelon of VMO-6's O-1 Bird Dogs and HOKs took part in operations with the 5th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, deploying to the Caribbean in support of the American blockade of Cuba. In 1963, the squadron was assigned the task of developing tactics for air support for helicopters. 6 North American T-28s were assigned for the short duration of the project. The data accumulated was subsequently incorporated into helicopter support doctrine. In 1964, a new aircraft entered the VMO-6 inventory. It was the UH-1E Bell Iroquois. As well as receiving the new Hueys, VMO-6 received a new maintenance hangar with squadron facilities on the second deck. VMO-6 continued its training and maneuvers in support of the 1st Marine Division, as well as training pilots, crewmen, mechanics, aerial observers, and all other required to fill out a fighting squadron. They were ready to go when and where they were needed. In August 1965, VMO-6 departed with MAG-36 aboard USS Princeton, bound for Vietnam.
On September 1st, the squadron offloaded at Da Nang and shared VMO-2's hospitality. They soon moved to Kihei Airstrip at Chu Lai. This was the airstrip right after we moved in. The squadron area is in the lower left corner of the mat. Also note that there is only one mat at this time, the south mat. This is Kihei later. Note the 2 mats and numerous buildings to the right of the mats. This was the initial squadron area. Later we had a hangar and real buildings. If you'll remember those marine condos back in Korea, I am convinced this was one of them without the hard frame. Note the tarp covering the hole in the roof. Of course we had plenty of amenities, cots, pallets to stand on, and a gasoline lantern for light. To complement our luxurious living quarters, we also had gourmet dining. Note the lack of chairs. Things did get better living-wise as the huts were constructed. Now established in Vietnam, the squadron's history became a matter of names and operations. Quang Ngai, Double Eagle, Blue Marlin, Duck Pho. The list becomes almost endless, each with its own special meaning to each Klondiker, the squadron's call sign. Early in October of 1967, the squadron moved to Wei Fu Bai as the Marines' focus shifted to the Northern I Corps and the DMZ. A month later, another move took the Cherry 6 emblem farther north to Quang Tri Air Base and another call sign, Seaworthy.
In October 1968, the first contingent of 6 OV-10A Broncos joined the Hueys and O-1 Bird Dogs of VMO-6. They immediately proved their worth, leaping into the fray within 18 hours of joining the squadron at Quang Tri. The list of places committed to memory by hard and oftentimes painful experiences grew. Khe Sanh, Con Thien, Jiolin, the Rockpile, Vandergrift, LZ Argonne. The name Seaworthy became synonymous with such operations as Dewey Canyon, Maine Crag, Apache Snow, Scotland 2, and Montana Mauler. In September 1969, VMO-6 departed South Vietnam for its new home at Marine Corps Air Station Futima, Okinawa. The Broncos, their air crews, and squadron personnel could be found throughout the Far East in such locales as Kubi Point, Philippines, Atsugi, Japan, Daegu, Korea, and the Republic of China. With them, in the shadows of over 45 years of service to their corps and country, followed a heritage that every man who has ever served with VMO-6 can be well proud.
In the fall of 1971, after it was learned that the squadron was to be deactivated, it was suggested that a Christmas card be sent to the Commandant reflecting the squadron's feelings over this deactivation. I don't think the card was ever mailed, but it certainly did convey the message. On 1 January 1977, the squadron was deactivated. As the VMO-6 book was closed, an aura of mixed emotions were felt. The most overriding was one of sadness, for although a squadron can always be reactivated, the end of an illustrious 45-year era occurred as the squadron became part of history, a history that helped make our Corps great and our country free. VMO-6 became deactivated, but those many thousands of Marines, Navy doctors, and corpsmen who have steadfastly served in our ranks will not forget. Nor will the history books forget the legend VMO-6 has etched in the annals of Marine aviation, in furthering its dedicated support of Marine ground forces in the cause of peace and freedom throughout the world during those years.